right, a good evening to each and everyone. As of now, we are 48 in this meeting room. Maybe later as we go along with our webinar, some of the participants will come in. But I already saw the Acting Chancellor of Mindanao State University. We have Juris Dr. Usman Aragassi. We also have our Dean and our ever supportive advisor, Ms. Ava Claire, Dr. Ava Claire Marie Robles, and I also saw the director of the Office of the International Affairs, Ms. Beverly Garcia, and our resource person. So I guess everyone is all set and ready. So let's begin with our program. Good evening once again. Magandang gabi po sa ating lahat. And I hope we're all doing great and safe tonight. And happy Women's Month to all the women out there, sa lahat ng mga Juana. And welcome to our webinar on Knowledge Co-Production Approaches, Indicator-Based Decision Support System for Coastal Communities. So as you may know, this webinar is hosted by the Sustainable Development Studies Program of Mindanao State University-General Santos City Graduate School Studies. By the way, I am Fitzgerald Carmona, Information Officer of the Commission on Population and Development, and at the same time, first-year student of Sustainable Development Studies. So to start with our program this evening, we will have the opening prayer to be followed by the singing of the Philippine National Anthem. So the theme for our national anthem is actually in line with this month's celebration, the National Women's Month. So as we pray, may we request everyone to please be in a moment of silence. All right, good evening and welcome once again to our webinar on Knowledge Co-Production Approaches, Indicator-Based Decision Support Systems for Coastal Communities. So as of now, we are 68 in the loop. So thank you very much for joining us in this webinar. I'm sure, for sure, you will really learn a lot from our resource person. To formally welcome us in this webinar, may we give the virtual floor to the brain of this program, the ever-supportive, ever-dynamic, and very approachable class advisor, and at the same time, the Dean of the Graduate School, Dr. Ava Claire Robles. Let's give her a virtual applause. Over to you, Doc.
My courtesy and respect to our Chancellor, Juris Dr. Usman Aragassi, sir. To our ever-active SDS students, headed by Sir Frederick John Benardo, to those people coming from various agencies, friends, students, good evening. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you, especially to our brilliant resource speaker, Dr. Pedris M. Orencio, in our first SDS webinar series. With our theme for tonight is on Knowledge Co-Production Approaches, Indicator-Based Decision Support System for Coastal Communities. I'm sure through this webinar, your knowledge will be enriched. It is my prayer that the knowledge gained from this activity will be serving as an avenue for you to have a significant change in your perspective. I would like to congratulate the prime movers of this webinar because without you, this event will not be possible. So once again, welcome and good evening, everyone.
All right, thank you very much, Doc Ava, for the support to this webinar. At this juncture, to inspire each and every one of us tonight, we will hear an inspirational message from the good Acting Chancellor of Mindanao State University. Ladies and gentlemen, Juris Dr. Usman Aragassi. Over to you, Doc.
Okay. Thank you again, Mr. Carmona, our host for this evening program. Please, of the School of Graduate Studies, Mr. Kipo, our class president, and of course, our very own research speaker, this evening program, Dr. From the various agencies of the government like FAR, the Minro of Kiamba, various LGUs of South Cotabato, and of course, participants, good evening. I am not only speaking taking as your chance of sustainable development. Remember, sustaining our environment, our ecology is not a responsibility of one agency of the government, but this is a responsibility for all of us, everyone. But let me give emphasis on this very important topic this evening. Again, we are very lucky because we have a brilliant speaker appreciating the value of realigning our mind and our very limited resources. Would not be preempting, of course, the very important topics, the topic that we would like to listen for this lecture this evening. But again, I presume this is all about capacitating our people, other stakeholders, decision making on how we can have a very good sustainable coastal area. Remember, sustainability from the primary concern of the United Nations. And we will be, of course, we are be an prime mover, how we can be an agent in doing this very important task. I praise all this encouragement so that on the part of the university, as your chancellor, we are now starting a lively recognizing the need to allocate part of our bigger funding to research sustainability of keep on discussing every now and then when we are having a meeting with our university officials on how to increase attention on some researches involving our coastal area. In fact, we are now trying to other agencies of the government, university out with all these agencies and other private entities having an attention on how to do a sustainable environment.
Right. I think the good acting chancellor is having problems with his internet connection, but I'm sure he'll join us in a short while. So for
Okay,
our
Mr. Carmona. Again, sorry for
it's okay, Doc. It's okay, Doc. It's okay, Doc.
okay. Again, thank you. I'm sorry we have to make you understand that the university is now starting realigning its direction on some possible research insofar as overseas, but we are not discounting the possibility that for as long as our people, professors in the university doing its work, we will be discovering unlimited resources insofar as doing research is concerned. So again, I'll not take you long because I'm very sorry we have a unstable internet connectivity. But in behalf of the university, as your acting chancellor, rest assured that we will be supporting all activities like this to the max. Again, thank you, Dean Robles and other students of the STS 296 for having this kind of activity. Again, good evening and enjoy this activity. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, our ever supportive acting chancellor. Once again, Juris Dr. Usman Aragassi. Let's give him a heart. Ayan, a heart reaction. Right. So at this point, to give the rationale of this webinar, we will hear a video recorded presentation from the Director of the Office of International Affairs. Ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Beverly Garcia, MPA. Let's watch the video.
Greetings of peace, love, and solidarity to all of you. First, I would like to salute with merit all the individuals behind this activity. Truly, you are responsive in sourcing out knowledge from these reputable speakers across national frontiers. I know you will be provided with updated, substantial input you need to reinforce the learning that you have in your subject and in preparation and augmentation of your prolific careers. Let me remind you that one of the targets of the Philippine Development Plan of 2017 to 2022 strategic framework, the Philippines will have a high level of human development by the year 2022. So you must enjoy this opportunity. And secondly, CMO 55 encourages internationalization among HEIs to encourage linkages and cooperation for world peace and development. So make sure you get the every inch of the knowledge. Be blessed. Thank you.
Very excited. But before that, allow us to give the background of our resource person. So to introduce our resource person for tonight's webinar, may I give the virtual floor to our group leader under Sustainable Development Studies program, who is also an instructor at Mindanao State University. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Frederick John Benardo. Sir, the virtual floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Sir Fitz. Good evening. Let me introduce to everyone our resource person for tonight's webinar. So Dr. Pedcris Orencio is currently the program head of the Research and Thought Leadership Department at the Southeast Asian Regional Center for Graduate Study and Research in Agriculture, or CIRCA. He is also a part-time faculty of Ateneo de Manila University's and San Beda University's Environmental Science Departments and a faculty in charge of UP Open University Masters in Environment and Natural Resources Management. Dr. Orencio received his Bachelor of Science in Fisheries from the College of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences, University of the Philippines, Visayas in April 1999, a diploma in Urban and Regional Planning in April 2006, and a Master of Arts in Urban and Regional Planning in October 2008, all from the School of Urban and Regional Planning, University of the Philippines. He also finished his Master of Environmental Science in October 2011 and his PhD in Environmental Science Development in 2014 in the Graduate School of Environmental Science, Hokkaido, University of Japan. Dr. Orencio has more than 20 years of experience in environmental research, facilitating policy and planning towards improving programs in agriculture, fisheries, and natural resources management, and enhancing the resilience of urban and coastal socio-ecological systems concerning water, energy, and food. Presently, Dr. Orencio has already gained 1,025 citations based on Google Scholar and has an H index of 7 and I-10 index of 7 as well. He is a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Fisheries Technology and Aquatic Sciences and is also a member of different professional organizations such as the Philippine Association of Japanese Scholars, the Philippine Association of Marine Science, and the NRCP, or the National Research Council of the Philippines. So with that, let us all welcome our resource person, Dr. Pedcris Orencio.
Okay, thank you for putting up my slides. So maybe next slide, please. Okay, thank you. So, well, everybody knows that there exists this huge gap between accepting to be disaster prone and implementing risk reduction, particularly in the Philippines. And despite this existing knowledge and the viable knowledge system that our communities have, these two extremes, on one hand, acceptance of disasters, and the other hand, implementation of risk reduction measures still exist. And a term we use to describe this is what we call culture of disaster. And it was coined basically to recognize like people experiencing disaster events according to their characteristics, particularly the probability and consequences of events or hazardous events, and these events with tag as low probability and high giving less priority to disaster interventions. We can see like programs are more reactive and limited to emergency relief. They are not integrated in the development planning process. It's inadequate in terms of hazard monitoring and forecasting, and there are limited funds allocated for implementing effective disaster management systems. So in this presentation, I will try to talk about how coastal communities and their contribution to these knowledge systems could actually lead to a viable, resilient communities. So next slide, please. So why do we do a transdisciplinary approach? No, since I started talking about before my slides were put up about transdisciplinary approach. First, I think we must note that this is a key feature of sustainable development, and from what I've heard from the acting chancellor, and most of you are here, you are all advocates of sustainable development. When we talk about transdisciplinarity, we actually engage in an integrative approach. Basically, we go beyond the disciplinary differences, and this is more of like looking at the interactive space between two disciplines in the interdisciplinary, or maybe beyond the perspectives of other disciplines to inform the other disciplines, such as in the multidisciplinary approach, without having that necessary overlap. But on the purpose of creating knowledge, we can use this transdisciplinary approach to describe the complexity of the environment that we deal with. So next slide, please. So when we talk about complexity, this particular picture illustrates the different concerns. And these concerns actually influence the sustainability of a coastal community. Here you can find a mix of both internal and external factors. Internal meaning the system can be controlled and managed, while external, there are forces that are outside of the system that can actually influence the achievement of specific goals and objectives. And I guess most of you who are working in the coastal environment has some choices, which you would like to prioritize and resolve, And most of this, I would surmise, would actually be based on your understanding of things, and the sense of maybe a sense of place, or so your strong desire or passion to resolve that particular concern. These are all rooted to the type of knowledge that you have, and this knowledge are actually used or guides your decision-making process, and it's an equal measure of wisdom, which is actually a combination of experience and reflection. And all of these are actually part of the fundamental knowledge that are necessary for addressing specific concerns in a coastal community. Okay, next slide, please. So as I've mentioned, the choices reveals the type of knowledge which you may have acquired through experience and education. When we do a quick browse of the web for a definition of knowledge, it would reveal different terms such as facts, information, and it can also mean skills. I guess with this premise, we can surmise that definitely knowledge is something that is intrinsic and idiosyncratic, and it is more shaped and developed per individual, which can be applied in developing resilient systems. But knowledge can also be compounded to form this particular knowledge system. So this graphical presentation here is prepared by the FID and was cited in Decans in 2007. This talks about the knowledge systems that exist in communities according to their types, the relative factors that influence them, how they were packaged and actually used, and the approach for analysis as well as the intended outputs. So like any particular response you may have on the question of which you will prioritize in the various concerns that coastal communities have, usually these are based on experiences and more often, it's very difficult to describe because they are undocumented. And sometimes we call this tacit, no? And it requires a lot of interaction and data collection to be able to basically understand how this knowledge can be used in building resilient communities. Okay, next slide, please. So why co-production? So as I've mentioned, no, we have this existing knowledge system, and our society, our community is also a learning system, and this will benefit from the knowledge that each person have. So naturally, humans are averse to ambiguity, meaning we don't like unclear information. We need information to achieve that cognitive closure. No? According to Kruglensi 1994, we use and gather information and without necessarily taking the time to actually verify it as we otherwise should, no? But more often, this is driven by the need to preserve that closure for as long as possible. So we freeze our knowledge and do what we can to safeguard that knowledge and crystallizing our judgment so as not to appear very inconsistent with our decisions. So both the seize and the freeze, no, that Corinne Blancy have described here actually benefit from communication exchanges. And these are in communication exchanges, you produce knowledge which becomes an intellectual asset for a DRR system. And for this to prosper, this should undergo a series of interaction. And these processes are very important because you involve people of different types, of different expertise and experience, and produce and agree on specific pathways that can actually achieve sustainable development. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, taking premise on information, no, we can make decisions that could actually guarantee sustainable development. These quality decisions are needed for us to identify areas where we can expect more optimum results. So it allows us to use the time, synergize the resources, achieve consensus in a process that require participation. So in line with this objective of the talk, no, which is to describe how to come up with these pragmatic approaches for data collection, which could support, you know, this knowledge generation that would provide a more effective approach for decision making. We can adopt this approach for quantifying and qualifying individual views and the knowledge across communities to that can actually be described by different criteria following our development needs or our priority plans. So in this discussion, we would try to look at these pragmatic approaches on data collection and analysis towards designing that viable DRR system for coastal communities. Next slide, please. Okay, so how do we usually generate information for decision making? There are basically two ways. Now we have the paternalistic and participatory approaches. As we discussed, now the transdisciplinarity of the approach that we would like to adopt, you know, in coming up with information that would allow us to generate that knowledge and develop that viable DRR system, we dwell more on the participatory approach. So to elaborate, now we have Arnstein who described the ladder of participation and provided the early underpinnings on the context of participatory approach. But nowadays, new researches are already emerged, and they are look at collaboration, no, and integration as integral parts of the steps. And this is this concept of using collaboration and integration is advocated to achieve sharing of knowledge, power, and benefits among multi-stakeholders. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so information, we have the approaches, but information can be indicator based. And this could be observed even in the expert approach or the paternalistic approach. But now it has been gaining importance in participatory approaches. So to describe and to assess or manage the specific areas of concern. Indicators may actually differ respectively, based on the kind of information they represent. And of course, their specific purposes. Some indicators include, some indicator types include descriptive, performance, efficiency, and total welfare. A descriptive indicator could be used to illustrate a kind of happening, to human or environment, and we use this to establish a baseline information and later on assess the trends in development from this description. Performance indicator, on the other hand, describes targets. Describes a target, for instance, like a policy requirement, and efficiency illustrates the production or consumption trends, while total welfare could be used for dimensioning social conditions in certain geographical areas. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, given the earlier premise on the use of participatory approaches in generating indicator-based information, allow me to present some case studies. The first one actually uses data collected from outside sources to verify the viability of information from credible statistical sources. Hello? So the second is a subjective, hello?
Yes, Doc. Go on, Doc.
Okay, just unmuted myself. So the second is a subjective and more of a discretionary process of using indicators for undertaking a particular assessment of vulnerability. And the third approach is a bottom-up process wherein indicators are co-developed with communities, and the output of this framework was actually used in a two-pronged assessment tool to determine or evaluate the resilience of a particular coastal community. Okay, next slide, please. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Doc.
Yes, Doc.
Okay,
We can
thank you.
hear you po.
Okay, so one of, maybe we can start by saying that one of the premises for the use of the indicator-based approach is a framework, which we try to actually conceive based on a clear objective. And the objective is to reduce risk to achieve development. Technically, a variety of information generation activities is really required prior to having that good analysis and decision making, and this is what we've learned earlier, and particular this is due to the fact that not only community systems are complex, but various disasters affecting them are also multifaceted. So reducing disasters has been determined as a key to achieving sustainable development. Because they are not temporary, and the proactive mitigation is supposedly necessary and implemented. Second, since these disasters affect people, so the need to understand how to strengthen communities and groups should be considered. And finally, disasters influence many fields, such as human environmental relationships. And this includes activities that affect sustainable development and that encompass social, economic, and environmental fields. Okay, next slide, please. So let's start by understanding what is risk. So the purpose of understanding risk is actually to contribute to the protection and management of a particular element of a natural system. This includes both the people and the environment, and that's why we need a credible evaluation of the effects, particularly the occurrence of risk and the likelihood of risk. The assessment of risk involves a process of defining and then quantifying risk and how they affect the various system, and determining the level of acceptability of those risks. So risk actually results from their interaction of a particular stressor affecting social environmental process and results to a particular impact. But not all risks are hazard driven. There are also risks that are created out from the interaction that exists in the system. Remember that we have synergistic actions and reactions happening between parts of the system, and this continuous interaction and reaction also has negative impacts that affects the other. No, we're not involved in the reaction. So that this is the reason why we have to first understand risk, so that we'll know the factors, the determinants that really affects the natural system. Okay, next slide, please. Basically, there are three prevailing concepts when we look at risk, and these are the vulnerability, the hazard exposure, and of course the relative impact. So to explain these concepts, let us look at this model. This is what we call the hazard of place model by Cutter, and in this diagram, risk can be classified as changes that produce various stressors that affect the system depending on their level of vulnerability. So you have the physical and the social vulnerability. So when the system is impacted, the result of this is actually a new system or a new environment. Hence, a response should be developed to adapt to the changes, and of course the relative occurrence of hazards, as well as know how these concepts are actually interacting area specific. And this is also the reason why it is sometimes difficult to nationalize or regionalize the context. But it may be convenient to use this model to actually provide localized assessments given the purpose of being area specific. Okay, next slide, please. So to put the assessments into context, allow me to use a paper that I published in 2013 about risk assessments. We must note that it is an old data that in 2009, the Philippines has been ranked #1 by CRED, or the Center for Research and Epidemiology of Disasters, as the most disaster-stricken country in the world. And I think up to now, we're still on the top 5 of the most at-risk countries to natural hazards. So different organizations have reported disasters that affected the Philippines according to losses and damage evaluation. But we can find here that though there are more incidents of human-induced hazards than natural causes, the effects of natural causes are still greater. So in this risk assessment, we will focus at the risk assessment of natural hazards affecting the Philippines. Okay, next slide, please. So in this risk assessment process, this framework was used. wherein risk is considered a product of the probability of the hazard and its consequences. Probability was described as the inverse of the recurrence interval over time, and consequence as the cost of damage per capita. So the unit of risk was actually analyzed as the cost of damage per capita over the period of analysis. So for each of the natural hazards that we assess, we look at the probability and its consequence, and come up with this disaster risk potential. And all these disaster risk potentials were analyzed spatially, in its particular area of occurrence and incidence, and to compute for the overall disaster risk potential of that area. Okay, next slide, please. So for this analysis, we use a 30-year information from CRED, using the emergency database. The emergency database is actually a global data set of reported disasters from different sources. The information were actually packaged per the provincial level. There are some reports that are area specific, but for the interest of this assessment, all information were actually extrapolated to the provincial level. So since these reports are coming from different sources, the EM that organized them per year, per area, per type of hazard, depending on the reports that submitted by international agencies. So from the graphical presentation, we can observe that most disaster events were actually meteorological hazards in nature, and followed by hydrological and biological came in last. So since this is the 30-year period that discovered was 1982 to 2011, maybe there will be changes in this occurrences, given that and also in terms of the damages, and the impact, given that recently we have experienced a pandemic. Okay, so you can find that the CRED EMDATs actually organized according to 5 hazard types. You have meteorological, climatological, hydrological, geophysical, and biological. And that there's a specific description of this disaster type, and of course their subtypes. Okay, next slide, please. So the first process in this risk assessment was actually to characterize the hazard. Firstly, the mutually exclusive hazard components based on the availability, and of course establish the components measurements were determined. So then based on these measurements, disaggregated scores are assigned. So you can find here hazard components include the area of coverage, the frequency of events, the duration of the events, the affected population, and the cost of damage. So using these key hazards and the measurements that were assigned to use as units of measurements, and then how the disaggregated component scores were computed. All of this were annualized for an analysis. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the result, this annualized data for each hazard component. You can see here this annualized data for each hazard component were actually combined, and the results were then presented in spatial form. So I use GIS to present all the computed information. So in this graph, you can find the top 10 provinces based on the relative influences of different hazards. So among the 82 provinces analyzed, by the way, Metro Manila in this case was considered to be a province, given that so this is the only categorization that I use, so that all assessments will be similar across. No, so we can see that Metro Manila was considered to be highly influenced by most of the hazards, no? And followed by Pangasinan, and then Ilocos Sur, and last is South Cotabato. So where General Santos is, no? But you can see that the contributions of most hazards were, as I mentioned, are meteorological in nature. But there are also hazard sites that contributed to this overall hazard, the hydrological and the geophysical. Okay. In this succeeding graph, you may find now the top 10 provinces with the highest risk potential. So risk potential was actually computed based on the aggregated risk from different hazard types. No, as you can see, as you may remember, risk was computed according to the probability and the consequence of the hazards. So the results were then also presented in this map format. This showed that 4 of the provinces are actually small island provinces. This is very interesting result. While the 4 provinces are coastal and 2 provinces are mountainous areas. So we can observe that among those that were among this 10 provinces that were ranked to be highest in terms of risk potential, the highest risk is still due to meteorological hazards, and followed by hydrological and then geophysical. Okay. To further understand, next slide, please. Okay, so to further understand the relationship of the probability and the consequence, in determining, this 82 provinces, a risk quadrant was used. All the 82 provinces were plotted in here according to their level of risk based on probability and consequence. You can see along the arrow, the provinces on the left, and on the topmost left-hand side, encircled in blue, are the provinces with high probability, while the ones encircled in yellow are the ones with high consequence. So from this graph, we can observe that most of the top provinces with high risk potentials have high consequence than probability, while Aurora is the only province having a high mark on both probability and consequence. So despite Aurora landed, I think, number 2 in the hazard risk assessment, when we plotted it in a risk quadrant, Aurora emerged to be in the quadrant that landed in the quadrant with high consequence and high probability. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, thank you. So now let us try to visualize this risk in coastal areas, because as you can see, the assessment of risk was actually done on a provincial scale. But then if we would like to visualize these concepts in the coastal areas, we need to understand what caused this risk from happening. So vulnerability is one of the major elements of why a place or an element is actually at risk. Risk comes from, we noted earlier that actually risk comes from complex environmental systems, and these are also brought by new or emerging phenomena. And coastal communities are always exposed to risk effects because of their vulnerable conditions. But we have to note that vulnerability actually varies according to their resilience character, meaning their inherent characteristics. And when we try to describe this condition, uh, we should note that this condition is actually influenced, no, by complex interaction. And in order for us to further understand, no, how these interactions are happening, we have to, for us to effectively manage the coastal resources, we have to understand them. And one way of understanding them is to use the indicator-based approach. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so to respond to the requirement of this risk mitigation of a particular place, I will now present this practical application of the composite indicators for analyzing vulnerability through a case study approach, which was undertaken in Baler, Aurora. So the municipality is actually located in the northeastern part of the Philippines and has 5 villages or barangays. The area is really interesting because of having a mixture of both social and environmental factors affecting the area. So approximately about 60% of the population is in the coastal areas, provides 43% of the per capita protein needs, and then 75% of poor people are engaged in agriculture, fisheries, and forestry. And we have noted that when we discussed about vulnerability and risk, the poorest people and the poorest countries are considered to be those that are really affected, because of the variabilities that affect their health, safety, and livelihood. This is according to IPCCAR4. Okay, so next slide, please. So in this study, a coastal community vulnerability index was actually constructed, and this followed a framework for vulnerability modified from the concept of buckle. So in this framework, I use 7 factors to describe, what to describe how these factors affect a coastal community and make it vulnerable. So I term this Coastal Community Vulnerability Index, and it is valued as a single measure of different situations, making it useful in establishing ranking and then comparing vulnerable situations across communities. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the framework for the CCVI. So based on the framework, there are 7 factors that were considered to affect vulnerability. So each of the 7 factors was first assigned, with indicators, and each indicators was then provided with different variables. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are the different variables, and these variables were then scored. Next slide, please. Based on a set of scales. So this set of scales as gathered from respondents' scores. So next slide. So all the scores were then aggregated to compute for the vulnerability index. Next slide, please. And then all the variables were then scored based on the responses that were actually gathered from a survey. So there were 85 variables that were used in this index to compute the level of vulnerability of that particular community. Okay. And this is the graphical map of the different factors in each community according to how they were how the different factors are affecting the level of vulnerability. And we can find here that among the 5 communities in the coastal area of Baler, Sabang, one of the barangay, is the most vulnerable, while Sabali, another barangay, is the least vulnerable. So while vulnerability may have been determined in this aspect, it's its negativeness, no, makes it difficult to describe the new sets of responses, no, that the communities need to become invulnerable. So in this case, an approach that looks at the positive side became a reason why a subsequent study that looked at community inherent capacity was then conducted. Okay, next slide, please. So, given the premise of that need for a positive side to describe the reason for establishing resilient, no, coastal communities, we look at this picture that describes a theoretical concept of how an at-risk community can actually be transformed into resilient communities simply by increasing their capacity. So in reality, this may sound simple, but determining which capacity to develop is quite difficult since it varies from one community to another. On the other hand, it is better to determine this individually or systematically to design, you know, appropriate and viable systems that are fitted to the general character of the communities at risk. So I first developed this resilience criteria following the review of related references. So next slide, please. So, so these are the different criteria based on the literature review that generally represents a community. And this was the selection of this criteria follows a process of prioritization using an AHP model, or the analytic hierarchy process. So in this model, the goal was placed at the top, wherein it's to establish a resilient coastal community. And the second and the third chairs describes the different, or represents the different criteria and their respective components or elements. So each criterion has two sets of components. One that's describing the inherent capacity, and the other that is describing the external enabling environment for system transformation. So in this process, I worked with 20 local members to prioritize the most important elements or alternatives across the different chairs using a pairwise comparison method. Next slide, please. So in selecting the best criteria that represent a resilient community, we follow this process of prioritization using the AHP, no? And the AHP is actually a multi-criteria decision assessment tool, which uses the process of decomposition, and composition. So by composition and decomposition, we produce the best criteria and elements that can respond to the particular subject matter, which is to establish resilient communities. So the selection process is based on establishing weights, no, determined from a pairwise comparison method and hierarchic composition. So this pairwise comparison method presents an objective mathematics that measures the decision maker's subjective preferences over the different alternatives that we put together for analysis. Okay, next slide, please. So for each level in the chair, so you have first level, which is the establishing a resilient coastal community. Second level, you have the different objectives or criteria. And the third level, you have the different elements. So for each of the level in the chairs, a decision table was first constructed where alternatives were compared by pairs, no, to determine their importance based on a set of scale or judgment. So you can find here on the left-hand side the different alternatives. There are compared on the x-axis and y-axis. So the comparison is between alternative A and alternative A. Alternative A and alternative A cannot be compared, but alternative A with alternative B with alternative A2, using the scales, scale 1 to scale 1, which describes a particular judgment of or preference. So the number of comparison was actually described by the formula n, and meaning if you have 7 alternatives compared with each other, you have n minus 1, or 7 minus 1 divided by 2. So you have 3 comparisons for 7 alternatives. And the reciprocal of which, that's this alternatives, that the number of comparison is determined to form this square matrix. And this square matrix is the one that we use for establishing the weights and the scores. Since there are 20 locals that that participated in this process, a consensus was actually achieved using the Delphi, and the score was decided using the geometric mean of all the scores. So all scores were then checked for their consistency and acceptability using this formula, the eigenmax minus n over n minus 1. And the consistency ratio of less than or equal to 0.1 was considered acceptable. So we used the scores that were coming out based on the Delphi and the geometric mean of the 20 people who participated in the process. Okay, so next slide, please. So that's the results, the eigenvalue, the normalized eigenvalue. So you just use this square matrix. It would just populate this one, and then all the scores were tabulated and computed the geometric mean, and all the maximum eigenmax was considered for checking the consistency, acceptability across the comparisons made for each of the level chairs. Okay, next slide. Okay, so based on this, the highest ranking criteria and their components were then selected. And out of the 7, like for instance, in the criteria that we used in creating this framework, I've actually selected 4 because this 4 already corresponds to the maximum statistical factor, or component score. So then these were all used in establishing this composite index. So the composite index is composed basically of a process-based and outcome-based indicators, and each indicator was assigned with weights based on the normalized methods using this one. The weight is equal to the actual weight minus the minimum weight of that particular indicator, and over the maximum minus the minimum. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the normalized weights of the selected criteria and elements will now be used for quantifying the outcome-based components of the resilient coastal community. However, since resilience should not be limited to outcome components, but must also include the process-based components, a framework for resilience index that both look at the outcome and process-based criteria indicators were then formulated. So in the weighting and scoring of indicators, you can find here the criteria, the 4 criteria, and their normalized weights based on the computation the standardized weighting system. And for each of the criteria, the selected elements for each criteria, like for instance ENRM, you have ENRM 1, 2, and 4, which corresponds to the maximum statistical factor that that achieve acceptability. So so this is for the characteristics of a resilient community, but on the other hand, the enabling environment. So you have two elements that were considered under each criteria. And this goes the same for sustainable livelihoods, for social protection, and planning regime. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. So, so as I described earlier, since what we're trying to do is to measure community resilience, and we should look at both at the process and the outcomes of the community and how this were achieved and developed through time. So we use this as a reference point for developing this framework for the process, process-based indicators. We adopt the steps in the ICBR model described by CAFO. But on the other hand, the left side, these are the AHP selected criteria elements. This serves as outcome indicators, and combining them both to measure resilient coastal communities, both the process and outcome indicators. So the process-based indicators were taken actually from the community-based risk reduction model from Indonesia Red Cross societies, and to quantify this index, a weighted linear combination approach was then developed. So that next slide, please. So this is the approach for the weighted linear combinations. So you have an index measurement of 1, and then you divide equally this measurement, the process indicator, as 0.5 and 0.5 each for the outcome indicators, and all elements in the process indicators are given equal weights. But on the other hand, each of the criteria that form the resilient communities based on the AHP model were all arranged in this process, and this also follows a weighted linear combination method. So at the onset, we can see that the criteria score comes from the summation of the weighted scores for each of the element representing the community character. You can see we have two elements under each criteria: the community character and the enabling environment, and this should be valued using that particular formula. So it's the summation of the community character and their respective weights and element scores, and also the enabling environment together with their weights and their element scores. So the outcome scores should be computed based on the sum of the weighted scores of the outcome criteria. So this process is computed based on the sum of the weighted averages of their elements, and the sum of the process indicators and the outcome indicators will then serve as the index score for that particular community that's being measured. So the weights were then the one provided directly from the results of the AHP model that we undertook in the process. Okay, next slide, please. So based on that framework and indexing process, we applied this in undertaking resilience assessment. So to undertake the resilience assessment, 3 concepts were actually considered. First, how information is actually shared. Is there a consultative process, and the collaborative discussions, which are basis for the relative significance of the process of the knowledge co-production. So going back to the topic of knowledge co-production, a two-pronged approach was applied, consisting of a survey and a stakeholder workshop, and these were conducted to determine the disaster resilience of coastal communities. The survey was based on a modified version of the scoring system with particular reference to the results of the resilience components that were identified to the AHP. And the workshop, on the other hand, tackled the 4 dimensions of resilience, no, to understand the emerging and the evolving trends for a DRR environment at the local level. Okay, next slide, please. So the two-prong method came up with this assessment results, and maybe just to highlight, it presented a systematic approach for collecting and managing both the perception experiences of coastal communities, and these are good inputs actually for planning and localizing DRR systems. First, we refer to the knowledge that are produced by communities. Second, the focus and the kind of information to be gathered when undertaking the further assessments was noted. And third, this collaborative scheme that encourages participation from other organizations to bring in a systematic generation of local knowledge that can be used for managing potential risks of coastal communities to disaster causing hazard. Based on the assessment, we found that these suggestions would address the issues related to the current system that is limited on preparedness and more on information and consultation only, because we have to note that collaboration and integration, as I've started talking earlier, is very important for achieving that sustainable development. And the absence of mechanisms for engaging organizations and institutions in undertaking DRR. If you can see here, the current system is very limited to the ones that are marked in blue, and they've named other organizations in this system, but are not really tapped or functioning accordingly. So based on the assessment as well, there is good understanding of the functioning environment of the ecosystem, and this should be maintained given that that system is complex, and it can always be affected by the changes in the natural environment that can also cause hazards and contribute to their level of vulnerability. Based on the assessment as well, there is this lack of basic services, and mostly we can observe this happening in poor and underserved households, and living in very fragile living conditions. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So just to maybe highlight some insights on this process of index development. So from this research, I could say that indices for vulnerability and resilience were actually developed based on specific considerations. Now, first, the indices follow the 3 pillars for its construction. You have to establish a solid theoretical framework, a sound methodology, and achieve that good quality data. Second, if we look at the how the process was being presented, it is a means to address some limitations for index development. So you can see that the index development process is very subjective. So in order for us to develop the factors that would really describe a particular community that we'd like to assess, there should be preliminary visits and rigid literature review, and in the process of selecting and scoring or assigning arbitrarily the weights and categories. We can use AHP as a mathematical tool to reduce this subjectivity. And we noted this data collection difficulties, and that's why we use compounded approaches, multi-pronged or data collection and validation processes. And so I guess it's very important to establish that level of collaboration with groups and institutions, no, from the communities. Okay, next slide, please. But since we've noted that indices were really really found beneficial, no, for establishing this development, no, particularly in coming up with the needed information based on the prevailing knowledge systems in the communities. It actually measures various conditions. Using the indicators, we're able to simplify, no, the multi-dimensional character of the coastal environment. So, in the process, you have social data, and when we collect them and convert them into useful information, it makes it suitable for planning, for programming, and for coming up with decision making, particularly on mitigation and adaptation activities under the DRR system that we would like to establish. And this overall makes it makes the indices really an effective tool for policy and public information. I just would like to highlight, no, this the establishment of the index follows important steps, no, from measurement to compilation of data to aggregation using statistical tools and analyzing them through summation notations or generally weighted formulas, and then interpreting them and using them for making decisions. So basically what we have here is data that's being converted in decision making for the being converted into information for decision making activities. Okay, next slide, please. So another important contribution of this index is our intention to support the local government's compliance with precautionary principle. So in most cases, it's actually government benefiting from the information coming out from the results of the assessments. No? And when we talk about precautionary principle, it is a framework that guides decision makers to manage the environment of like future events or generations. No? So this composed of 5 elements, no? Namely anticipatory action, the right to know, alternatives assessment, cost accounting, and participatory decision making. So for anticipatory, it provides decision makers the pointers for addressing risk-related issues. The right to know, on the other hand, is more on the providing the public the information about vulnerability and resilience capacities. Alternative assessments, the basis for constructing options, no, for risk management, and for cost accounting, possible inputs for allocating resources for adaptation and mitigation, and decision making, the involvement of multi-stakeholders on assessing vulnerability and resilience, particularly achieving through achieving information and that went through public consensus. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the general contribution in the anticipatory action is really on enhancing the disaster risk assessment. So you can see here that the importance of disaster risk assessment to development planning, and the disaster risk assessment includes different steps from hazard characterization to consequence analysis and coming up with risk evaluation. These are all necessary information to come up with approaches, no, that would support development planning. So simply because, no, the information that we have generated by the index includes social information, and this adds context basically to the physical assessment that are required for local governments. Next slide, please. Okay, so for the right to know, we actually responded to question who is at risk and what factors affects them. So the index was able to provide information of who among the assessed communities were at risk and which vulnerability factors. So in this case, you have here the 7 factors that were assessed, no, and their level of contribution to the vulnerability. On the other hand, we can use maps, no, or graphs to present the general information to make it easily understood by the public in general. Okay, next slide, please. So, for allocating resources to develop resilience, this is our response to the requirement for cost accounting. And based on our assessments and validation with communities, we have identified 4 major criteria for resilience. No? And these 4 criteria are actually useful information for establishing these focus areas for development. For instance, we have communities that believe that with proper support for environment and natural resources, for livelihood, and establishing that support systems and participation of communities in planning will make them resilient to the effects of the disasters. And knowing this makes future allocation and funding and of resources more effective. Okay, next slide, please. So for alternatives assessment, what's very important is how we establish consensus. Among the many things that contribute to the alternatives assessment is the multi-stakeholder decision-making process, particularly during the selection of the criteria for resilience using the analytic hierarchy process. On the other hand, for validation, no, we were able to achieve, important information during resilience workshops, basically answering the question how to build the resilience of coastal communities. Okay, next slide, please. And the last consideration for the precautionary approach is the participatory decision-making process. And in this case, we were able to improve on this process by involving more people. For instance, during the validation of the results of the social survey that were conducted for analyzing vulnerability, the communities were able to share their local knowledge in making a map of the resources. So this map shows consistency of the results of proximity to resources and the general conditions for management and use of the coastal and fisheries. Okay, down to my last slide. Basically, as my takeaways, my last parting messages for this, for your takeaways, would be on what can we learn from this undertaking. So first, we note that information generation is really necessary aspect in decision-making process, and this can be undertaken through participatory collaborative approaches. So you don't have to be very heavy on paternalistic or expert-oriented researches. We can gather important information and knowledge from the communities who can enjoy the benefits of development in the process. So to achieve sustainable development of coastal areas, one must consider the transdisciplinarity in assessing and managing risk from disasters. So if they're involved in the process of decision making, you can expect increased level of participation and adoption of technological approaches, practices, improvements, brought about by system programming. So to manage their vulnerability and achieve resilience of their communities. So building resilience of communities can actually benefit from a development of pragmatic tools for assessment. So it's in this case, it's important that the tools may be crafted together with the communities, and based on the results, can be further validated with them, to make it useful, particularly in decision making process. And vulnerability and resilience can be measured by indicator-based methods, and we can see this happening, in what I have presented earlier. And this can be complemented by workshops, participatory workshop, validation, and these are all useful in designing a more viable DRR system for coastal communities. Okay, so this ends my sharing of insights for tonight. Thank you for listening, and I'm open to questions should there be any.
Sir Ryan, kindly facilitate.
Okay, sir.
Again, may I request everyone to please turn on your cameras for our picture taking.
Okay. Done.
Okay, thank you, Sir Ryan, for facilitating. All right, so we've come to the last part of our program, the closing remarks. So to give us the closing remarks, may we call on the class president, our class president of SDS 296A for Sustainable Development Studies Program, Mr. Carl Vincent Cuepo. A round of applause, please.
Thank you so much, Fritz. This has been a wonderful educational webinar, and really appreciate, and we really would like to thank our resource person, Dr. Pedris Orencio, for giving us a wonderful time and learning session. Thank you very much for this opportunity. And we also would like to thank the Acting Chancellor, Usman Aragassi, Juris Doctor, and MPA, who led us in implementing an activity like this. And to our very warm thank you to our Dean and Professor Doc Ava Claire Robles of MSU for coaching us and coaching us how to conduct a seminar, an international seminar like this. And also to the team led by Fritz and Frederick, Fritz Carmona and Frederick Benardo and Ryan Jama. Thank you very much for this wonderful, and the rest of the team for this wonderful facilitation and activity. Congratulations to all of you. And also to the participants from BFAR, DepEd, ANIA, Benro Kiamba, Benguet State University, who really participated from as far as Benguet, ECPC Sarangani, LGU Maasim, College of Fisheries of MSU. Thank you everyone. And it's been a very productive and very informative night. And I really appreciate everyone listening and learning from each other. Thank you and good evening, everyone.